Hello, welcome back to our coastal processes and landforms videos for the AQA Geography. We are looking at the different landforms now that are created along coastal environments. So we have looked at the processes that go on along coasts, such as erosion, deposition, transportation, and mass movement. And what we're now going to look at is how those different things lead to the formation of different landmarks or different features along the landscape. So we're going to start off with headlands. So these are erosional features. So if you think about the river's course, if you've done that, you look at three different types of landforms. You look at erosional and depositional, and then just depositional, and we do the same for coasts. If you can also try and draw parallels to the river's topic, that is something that is well worth doing, because the processes that go on that lead to the landforms are actually very, very similar for both rivers and for coasts. And I'll hopefully try and point that out as we go through this PowerPoint and others. So first of all, what is a headland? Well, a headland, quite simply, is a bit of land that sticks out into the sea. So this is a nice picture here of a coastline. You've probably seen very similar ones before. And this bit here that's sticking out, and this bit here, and this bit here, are all called headlands. Again, this is another picture here. You can spot the headland. Well, again, there's three. Someone's actually standing on one, but the obvious one is the one there in the middle. Land jutting out. Again here, there's another one there. So they're just basically hard rocks which are jutting out into the sea. We call them cliffs from time to time, and there's other names that they're given to them as well. But that's what a headland is. It's the hard rock that is sticking out. A bay, on the other hand, must be something similar to do with headlands, because headlands and bays are always linked. What a bay is a bit of land that goes inland. So again, on here you can see a beautiful sandy bay there. Another sandy bay there. So this is the soft rock which has been worn away more than the headland, and it normally creates a sandy beach. Sometimes it might be a bit of a shingle pebble beach. So we've got two landforms along the coast, headland and bay. We start off with headlands and bays because headlands help us to understand the next landform that I'll talk about later on in this video. So what are headlands and bays? Well, first of all, you need to understand that when you are asked in an exam to explain how headlands and bays form, or explain how an erosional landform forms at the coast, you have to sequence it. So that's why I've put this slide on, just to show that you need to sequence it. You also need to include geographical words that you've looked at before, specifically shown here, the erosional processes that will be going on in the coastal environment. You also need to think about it in your head as separate stages, separate kind of levels of what's going on. And if you think of it in that way, then that'll help you to formulate kind of a flow of what you need to say in the correct order. And it also shows the examiner that you know what you're talking about and helps you eke up to those better marks. So there's a few diagrams here. I'm going to go on to just quickly slip through these diagrams. So these ones. So I like to see most of these processes in rivers and in coasts as 4 stages, probably because my brain works that way. You might want to do it in 5 or 6. It doesn't really matter, but I'd recommend about 4 stages to get you some good marks, especially for a 4 or a 6 mark question. So there are very, very simple processes going on along the coastline. So a coastline starts off almost straight, as you can see in diagram 1. It doesn't start off how we see it today, because remember, it's been there for thousands, millions of years. And so what happens is you've got different bands of rock which have formed. We call them discordant bands. If you can't remember discordant, just remember that one's a hard band of rock, one's a soft band of rock. And because you've got hard and soft, well, soft erodes faster than the hard rock. And so as the soft rock gets eroded away, so by the arrows, it then creates bays and headlands. So the soft rock erodes out into bays, and the hard rock just remains kind of where it was as a headland. And you can see on diagram 2, the yellow dotted line is where the original headland would have been, or original coastline I should say would have been, and it's been eroded away. But you can see that the green bands, which are the less resistant soft rock, have gone in further than the brown and the white bands, which are the harder rocks. Now it erodes because of hydraulic action and abrasion, and that causes the cliffs to retreat. You've heard that word before, hopefully, when we're talking about rivers and waterfalls. So retreat, or to go back. And so you can see the coastline is retreating. Number 3, what happens then is that as it continues to retreat, you then start to get really obvious bays forming. So you can see that in the green areas here, and then really obvious headlands forming in the white and the brown. Then finally, number 4, what can happen, and we'll talk about this at another stage, is that in the bays you're going to get deposition happening, and that's because the bays are slightly more sheltered than the headland. What you've got to think about is if waves are coming in along this coastline here, the first thing that the wave is going to hit is the headland, so the white and the brown, and then it will eventually go into the bays, which means that most of the energy is gone by the time it hits the bays, and that's why bays have beaches in them, and headlands tend to have like rocky outcrops, boulders scattered at the bottom of them if the sea was to go out, and so that's the formation of headlands and bays. That leads us nicely on to our next thing that we need to look at, which is cliffs. So obviously we've been talking about headlands and bays, and sometimes headlands are called cliffs. Well, cliffs form because of the processes that you're going to see here. So as you can see, a cliff, if you were to look at it in a cross-sectional view, will be a very sheer-faced rock wall, basically, with water at the bottom. And what happens is that you've got kind of 3 zones on a cliff. You've got what we call the low tide zone, which is shown on the diagram, the mean tide zone, which is where the tide would normally be, and the high tide zone. So remember when we looked at waves, we talked about tides, and tides having an influence on the coast. Well, as the tide comes in, it's obviously going to be higher on the landscape, which means it's going to erode a different part to when it's at a low tide, and a different part to when it's at kind of normal tide. And so you get these different layers of erosion, or different zones of erosion. Well, what happens is because the tide is mainly at the mean tide zone, it cuts in more there, it erodes more there. And you get this thing here, where the mean tide is, called a wave cut notch. And that wave cut notch is kind of like if you're doing woodwork and you're cutting out a little bit of wood with a chisel. Well, that's going to be a notch. And so that's what's happening in the cliff. So you get this wave cut notch, and it gets deeper and deeper into the cliff. And as it gets deeper and deeper into the cliff, well, the cliff above it becomes weakened due to erosion and weathering and different processes that are going on above it. And that cliff face will eventually collapse. And what will happen is, as it collapses, it will actually leave behind an area where the cliff used to once be. Or what I should say is once used to be attached to the land. And so it leaves behind this thing called a wave-cut platform. And wave-cut platforms can only be seen at low tide. And that's because the wave-cut platform is hidden by water during normal and high tide environments. And so that's how a cliff forms and then eventually retreats. And if you think about waterfalls and gorges, they kind of happen in a similar way. So you're getting obviously the erosion at the bottom, and as it erodes at the bottom, then the top collapses into the water. And so that constantly goes on, that process, and then cliffs constantly retreat. What you can see on your screen now are 2 images of these cliffs going on, and there's lots of arrows on here. So you could be expected to annotate a photograph or an image in your exam. You need to be able to do this anyway, or in your head at least, if you're given a picture to explain what's going on. And what you can see on this cliff here is different things going on. So obviously you've got the cliff top right at the top. You've then got the cliff face. You can then also see the cracks in the cliff face. If you look here, you can see a different colour in the rock. So you've got kind of lighter rock and then darker rock. As I was talking about the high tide, the low tide and the mean tide zones. Well, this is the high tide zone here, where the top of this kind of black, between the black and the white or the lighter coloured rock, and that's the high tide zone, because ultimately this rock here has been affected by the water, and that's why it's changed colour. You've then got the wave cut notch here. You can kind of just see it on the picture, and on the bottom you can see where the waves have been crashing. That's actually the wave cut platform that's been left behind. If you look at this other image here, you can see the layers of rock again. This is probably the high tide zone here that this one's pointing out, and then the wave cut notch you can see clearly underneath there. In terms of what these processes can also lead to, you can get the formation of something called caves, arches and stacks. So these here are called the 12 apostles in Australia, because there's 12 of them, and as you can see, these are pinnacles of rock that go along this coastline here, and these are called stacks, and we're going to look at how they form. So again, this is a 4 to 6 stage process of what's going on. You can see here we've got 6 images because it makes it a bit easier to split it into 6. And you've got 6 things going on to create these caves, stacks and stumps. The stages are quite simple, and what you'll see is that the one leads on to another quite nicely. So the first thing that happens is you have a headland that juts out into the ocean or into the sea. So these always happen along headlands. So it's a very slow process that's going on because it's eroding hard rock. And so in the headland, as I said, you get natural cracks and faults that are there. And that crack will get attacked by erosion of by the sea waves, and eventually in number 2 here you can see that's widened, it's got deeper, and that crack forms into a crevice or a bigger crack, and then over time hydraulic action and abrasion continues to wear away at the cliff face at this headland, and it will form a cave. And you might have been into caves if you've been to coastal environments on holidays, for example, and those caves are formed because of the constant erosion, the hydraulic and the abrasive erosion of the headland over hundreds and thousands of years. But over time what will happen is that cave here will break through the headland. Remember, a headland is sticking out into the sea, and this is happening along a headland. So it will eventually, this cave, break through because of erosion. It'll break right the way through the headland, and you'll be able to see from one side of the headland through to the other. And that forms your arch, or a sea arch. But then what will happen is the top here of this arch, we call it sometimes the bridge, will get attacked by weathering processes such as freeze thaw. It might also get a bit of biological weathering happening, so plants growing in there or animals burrowing in it, and it will erode it and break it down and weaken this top bit of the arch, this bridge here. And what will happen eventually is that that arch will collapse, and then it'll leave the headland and then a bit of land left over, which used to be part of the arch, that we now call the stack. And then eventually what will happen is the stack will get eroded and attacked by weathering and erosion, and then leave behind a stump. And then eventually the stump will totally erode away and you won't see anything. And that's the process that goes on from being just a crack in the rock, in the cliff face in the headland, right the way through to being a stump at the end of it. This is an example of Durdle Door in Dorset. You may have seen Durdle Door on the news during the coronavirus outbreak, which is where loads of people congregated during the cliff jumping. But you can see here that there's cracks in this headland that's jutting out. There's a cave that's forming just around about where the cursor is now. In fact, along here is kind of a long cave forming, and it's then formed over time this arch. And so it's a process, and along one stretch of headlands you can see all those processes happening, from a crack all the way through to a stump. This is the Old Harry Rocks again in Dorset, and you can see a cliff arch, an arch here is collapsed. You've got actually a cave forming there, and that's Old Harry there, which is a stump. Old Harry's wife is somewhere under the ocean. That's it. I know it was a long video. Hopefully it's helped. So those are features formed by erosion along the coastline. Thanks, and hopefully you join me for my next video. Bye.